Hello, everyone, and thank you for joining us for the very first of the 2023 Lunchbox Lesson series from Schoharie Crossing State Historic Site. I'm pretty excited about this one, and I hope that you will be as well. John Callaghan is the director of the Hudson River Black River Regulating District, a position that he has held since 2019. Previously, John was the acting executive director of the New York State Canal Corporation. He's a veteran of the U.S. Coast Guard, and his service to New York State has also included terms on the Legislative Bill Drafting Committee and at the New York State Museum. He has a tremendous amount of experience with waterways and also the logistics and management of them. He's also been heavily involved in local community governance. He resides in Waterford with his family, and on a personal note, John is also a pleasure to take a canal cruise with, and a rescuer of many drowning conversations while doing so. So please welcome John Callaghan.
Thanks so much, Dave, and it's great to be with you all. I've been all authorized here to share a screen, and that is what I am going to attempt to do starting now. I assume Dave will virtually kick me under the table if the screen is not coming through, but it appears on my end that it is. See a thumbs up. So, folks, as advertised, I am John Callaghan. I am the executive director of the Hudson River Black River Regulating District. I'll tell you a little bit about the regulating district today, our mission, storied mission, and our important mission, certainly. Also, we're going to focus on the Hudson River area, the Great Sacandaga Lake, which is our largest storage reservoir and indeed the largest reservoir within New York State under anyone's jurisdiction, and with an emphasis on a project that we have coming up on the Great Sacandaga Lake. So just a quick note about us and our mission. It's to construct, maintain, and operate reservoirs in the Upper River and Black River watersheds, including the Sacandaga, Indian, Black, Moose, and Beaver rivers, for the purpose of regulating the flow of streams or rivers when required by public welfare, including public health and safety. And I'll touch on that a little bit later in the presentation, what we actually regulate. We do not regulate the levels of the reservoirs under our jurisdiction. We regulate the flows downstream of those reservoirs, and the elevation of the reservoirs under our jurisdiction is a function of that regulation. So it's, some people kind of look at it as maybe the tail wagging the dog, but we'll talk more about that within the context of our statutory mission. We are organized into two areas, the Black River watershed and the Hudson River watershed, as you can see depicted on this map. But today we're going to concentrate on the Hudson River Regulating District portion of that two watershed agency that we have today. The Black River Regulating District was created in 1919 rather. The Hudson River Regulating District created in 1922. They were statutorily combined in 1959 to the organization we have today, the Hudson River Black River Regulating District. And the Hudson River, again, we're going to focus on the Hudson River area side of the organization today. The impetus for the creation of the Great Sacandaga Lake, originally Sacandaga Reservoir, was to regulate the flows of the Hudson River downstream to create additional flows during those drier months in the summer for purpose of industry and hydropower generation, electric and otherwise, and also for flood protection. And this was heavily studied over many years, as you can see here, beginning in 1867 and culminating right up into the 1920s. But that 1913 period where you see the Conservation Commission issuing a report after years of study is a really critical period, and we'll talk briefly about that. And it is in no small reason attributed to flooding that was absolutely catastrophic across the U.S. in 1913, known as the Great Flood. But really here in New York State, the impacts were heavily felt especially in the city of Albany, as you see an image here of Broadway during that 1913 flood. Some additional images here of Albany during the 1913 flood. And this flood was not just an immediate public health and public safety emergency during the flooding itself, but as you'll see, created some significant public health damages that really galvanized public support and, importantly, legislative support to go forward with the creation of the Hudson River Regulating District and the construction ultimately of the Great Sacandaga, what is today the Great Sacandaga Lake. There's an old commercial, folks may be familiar with it, where someone is saying, "I'm not just the hair club for men president, I'm also a member." This is where, as David alluded to earlier, I point out that I am a Waterford, New York resident, born and raised. And so this mission of flood protection is near and dear to my heart. If you look at this scene here from 1913, the house on the corner just to the right is the house that I live in with my family today. So growing up in Waterford, my years working with the Canal Corporation was always very cognizant of the important mission here in terms of flood protection that we do provide. So just sort of a summary of that great flood in 1913 occurred over the course of March 23rd to the 28th. $330 million in property damage. And this is beyond just New York State, an estimated 650 fatalities, again, across 14 states, widespread infrastructure damage, a peak flood level at Albany of 24.4 feet, which also inundated the filtration plant for the city of Albany's public drinking water supply, resulting in 160 cases of typhoid fever. And that's the aforementioned sort of galvanizing point for New York State leaders to really get behind the prospect of creating some flood protection through a storage reservoir or reservoirs. So again, this was well covered in the media. This just refers back to why the Sacandaga Reservoir was created, owing back to that galvanizing moment, the 1913 flood. So when New York State leaders looked at where they might create these storage reservoirs in the Hudson River area, they considered several sites. And in fact, well over a dozen reservoirs in the Hudson River area to provide flood protection downstream. They settled on construction of a dam at Conklingville on the Sacandaga River. Here you can see an early plan for that dam that would impound the Sacandaga River and create ultimately what is the largest constructed reservoir within the state of New York. And today it is the sole, along with some benefits from the Indian Lake Dam and our management of Indian Lake, flood control device that protects New York's capital city from flooding and also other communities along the Hudson River, both north and slightly south of Albany. The construction of the Conklingville Dam was an engineering marvel. It was completed in 1930, so we're rapidly coming up on its centennial, and it utilized construction techniques that were fairly recent in development, and it was, to say that it was a Herculean undertaking would be a gross understatement. The methodologies that needed to be employed from an engineering standpoint were state of the art. And for this region, it was a project that was breathtaking really in its size and its scope. Again, orchestrated under the leadership of the chief engineer at the time, Edward Sargent. Here you can see various pictures of the project underway. At the time, you see rail cars removing material, and you can see this material being sluiced or recovered from that area, dewatered, and utilized in the construction of the earthen dam itself. Some additional pictures of the workers on site. Here are pictures of the outlets for the low-level outlets or dowel valves that are embedded in the dam itself. Another picture looking east along the spillway channel. Our excavation, spillway channel. If you drive across the dam itself today, you are driving over the dam, the earthen embankment section of the dam, and this is a bridge that is at the north end of that embankment over the spillway channel itself. And here you see the finished dam, the earthen embankment section. Another image of the earthen embankment section focusing on the downstream side with the causeway running over the top. Picture of the gatehouse, outlets for the dowel valves, and then to the right, see the spillway for the dam. Another image of with an embankment section of the dam with the causeway across. This is looking north, this view. Downstream is to the right and upstream to the left. And once the dam was completed, they could not water up soon enough. So soon, in fact, that people scrambled to remove houses and other structures. Even the railroad needed to get out just ahead of the rising water as depicted in this image. I know David will show during this presentation the link to our website, HRBRRD.ny.gov. I just want to draw folks' attention to a video that can be accessed on our YouTube channel directly off of our website, Harnessing Nature. This tells the story of the creation of the Great Sacandaga Lake. We don't take credit for it. It was a project of the Great Sacandaga Lake Advisory Council just a few years ago, but we do host it on their behalf. We are a member on our YouTube channel. And it's a really great about 1 hour documentary of not just the engineering marvel that construction of the dam represented, but the impacts it had along the Sacandaga Valley, the communities that were displaced, the people that were displaced. So it's not a simple feel-good story without the real-life impacts that a project of this magnitude would necessarily cause, especially as this work was being done primarily to protect downstream communities, including the city of Albany. So certainly an interesting cultural dynamic there, and a very interesting, nuanced story about the construction of the reservoir, and we'd encourage everyone to check that out also. It's very well done. So we just want to go through sort of today's reservoir by the numbers. It cost $12 million and took 3 years to build. 27,000 acres of land were cleared for its construction. And again, part of that very complicated story is the fact that nearly 4,000 bodies needed to be reinterred from cemeteries that were in the path of what would become the new reservoir. 37 miles of highway constructed, 10 concrete bridges, 8 steel bridges encompassing the completed reservoir, 42 square miles, 3 dams, obviously Conklingville Dam, and also smaller spillways at both Mayfield and Northville. Conklingville Dam itself took 670,000 cubic yards of earth, 120,000 cubic yards of rock. It is 95 feet high. Again, that is not the spillway, which many people recognize as being the dam, but the earthen embankment that runs along that causeway section, and it's 1,000 feet long. So talk about a misleading headline. This is, the newspapers are not doing the regulating district any favors with this. They're sort of over-promising. We talk about we'll get into in a minute or two, sort of how the storage reservoir is intended to work. But it really does not, you can't flip a switch and turn off flooding. But what it does is provide capacity in times of high inflow into what would otherwise be an unmitigated flow directly downstream. So in periods of very high inflow, the Sacandaga Reservoir can absorb a lot of that inflow temporarily. Again, water, just like any matter, is not created or destroyed. It still exists. It's still going to flow downhill like everything else. But it's the timing of it that can provide peak period flood relief as an event is unfolding. And that's how storage reservoirs work, including this one at the Great Sacandaga Lake. So it's not a case of no more floods. It's really a case of flood impacts being lessened by virtue of the operation of storage reservoirs. And I think this is then a much better headline to describe what it is that the regulating district provides through its operations in terms of flood protection. It's a reduction. It times the water better, and it allows water that is going to come downstream anyway to be released gradually as downstream flows abate. And by prolonging the event, you take the peaks out of the event, reduce those flooding related impacts downstream. So we talk about, again, a storage reservoir and what it is we regulate. And a lot of people assume, understandably, that if you have a regulated body of water where you have control of outlet valves, or in our case, also a hydroelectric facility that can release water through the turbines, that level of that body of water is able to be fine-tuned much more accurately, much more efficiently and regularly and predictably than natural bodies of water. And certainly we like to point out that is the opposite is essentially true. What we do with storage reservoirs is we regulate the downstream flows. So in other words, we're not concerned statutorily and from a mission standpoint of what the level is of the reservoir itself on any given day, but we are looking at what the downstream flows are below. So the lake level itself on Great Sacandaga Lake or any storage reservoir is then a product of providing that flood protection or flow augmentation downstream. And you've heard a lot about, in the context of COVID-19 over the last few years, the term flattening the curve. And that's a term we like in the context of water management because that's essentially what we are doing. We're taking those peaks and valleys out of the downstream river flows. So more water during the ordinarily dry periods with the natural flows in the summer, less water downstream during the runoff in the spring, generally speaking. And there are certainly times outside of those typical cycles where we need to provide either flow augmentation or flood protection. So the result of that dynamic is really that the elevation of Great Sacandaga Lake, like other storage reservoirs, actually varies more than you would see in the case of a natural lake or other body of water. And as evidenced by Mother Nature's interesting personality this year, we're about 12 feet above our target elevation currently for this time of year due to about 175, 180% of average inflow. That snowpack is not there because that water is already run downstream, and the elevation of Sacandaga Lake, as it takes that inflow and stores it, is accordingly much higher than it would be. The flip side of this, when we talk about cycles and we talk about how things trade off, is we would expect less runoff in the spring and need to provide less storage for that reason. Is that always the case? And can we guarantee that it will be the case this year or any year? Absolutely not. But that is how some of those things do play out. Also want to note, and we do get this question a lot, if you're providing storage on the Great Sacandaga Lake, sticking with Great Sacandaga Lake, and you get 12 feet of rise, but you only have 10 feet to go to spillway crest, and you start discharging, why don't you build a little more capacity in the reservoir? Because once you start to spill at the spillway, you are no longer providing that flood protection downstream. And that's not actually correct, because the spillway has a capacity, just like a valve would. And if you are getting 15,000 cubic feet per second into the reservoir, but then you begin spilling at the spillway, and that's putting out, let's say, 2,000 cubic feet per second, depending on how much is spilling, you're still providing 13,000 cubic feet per second of flood protection. So you are still storing as the reservoir goes up, even as the reservoir begins to spill. I want to get into what will, for us, for this organization, be the largest, most complex, and most costly project it has embarked on since the construction originally of the Conklingville Dam, the creation of the Great Sacandaga Lake nearly a century ago, and that is generational remediation and repair project for the Conklingville Dam. Conklingville Dam is in very good shape for nearly a century old. I'd be so lucky. And it is built very well. It actually holds up, unlike other structures that are nearing a century older or older, very well in the context of modern dam safety, design, and best practices. Many other structures do not, but fortunately, this dam, Conklingville Dam, was built very well, which ultimately will reduce or control the scope and the cost associated with this major project. This is a project that we have been, regulating district long prior to my arrival, has been working toward. It represented a cost that was very difficult to fit within the regulating district's funding model. And anybody who has followed the regulating district for any period of time would know that beginning about 15, 20 years ago, there emerged a number of financial crises and problems and legal challenges from downstream hydroelectric operators, which sort of turned what had been for the better part of 80 years a very reliable, robust, and resilient funding model on its head. And it took certain costs that the regulating district did incur on an annual basis out of what could be passed along to downstream hydroelectric companies. This was a loss in federal court that the regulating district suffered. And going forward, the regulating district shifted a number of those costs in the Hudson River area to 5 counties and the state of New York downstream of the Great Sacandaga Lake. That in and of itself precipitated some litigation between the parties, and that was successfully resolved in 2013. But what remained was a very large cost to undertake this project. Working with our partners in state government, legislature, in the governor's office, and certainly with the support of stakeholder organizations around Great Sacandaga Lake, like the Sacandaga Protection Committee and the Great Sacandaga Lake Association, we successfully lobbied for and got external New York State budget funding, so we would not have to put this project on the backs of either residents around Great Sacandaga Lake, downstream beneficiaries, and try to then pass this debt service along to those beneficiaries. And that would have been certainly unsustainable from our perspective, from a funding standpoint. So we're very, very appreciative that we've been able to get in 2 successive state budgets, 2021 and 2022, $20 million in each budget, with the first $20 million reappropriated last year for a total of $40 million, which has been allocated for this project. Given the state's willingness to fund and undertake this important work because of the importance to the state, this project is being coordinated by the New York State Office of General Services in close coordination with us. So it really is a collaboration. We have a great working relationship with our partners there in state government and OGS, and working hand in glove to make sure this project gets done correctly and successfully for the general public. Scope and summary of this project is going to include spillway work, including some concrete replacement and anchors, spillway channel and rock foundation work, including resurfacing of some of those concrete areas and grouting. We're going to do work on other concrete structures like the abutments, outlets, and channel walls. We're going to look at seepage issues, where and if they exist, and eliminate or reduce that seepage through grouting or other measures. And we're going to replace what are sort of antiquated from a perspective of modern dam safety design and best practices, low-level dow outlets. So our men and women, our personnel, need to go down into the valve gallery at the base of that dam and open and close those valves physically from that location. We'd like to see that, and certainly modern dam safety design standards envision that being done remotely or from an upper level. So here's some images of that spillway concrete replacement and anchor work. You can see some earlier work that was constructed, that was undertaken in the 1980s. Just a little resurfacing of that spillway area. Here's some pictures of that aforementioned spillway channel. You can see where that grouting and concrete work would take place as the water runs down toward the EJ West power plant. Again, other ancillary concrete structures, any 100-year-old structure is going to have concrete work. It's going to have spalling. It's going to have cracking, especially in an inherently wet environment. So undertaking that work as well. Working very closely with our partners at OGS and the design consultant Bergman, which is really a world-class group we're working with to identify any areas of concern relative to seepage. And so far, those early assessments are indicating that there's not a lot of major work to be done on that front, which is really good news. And then again, we talked about personnel going down into that valve gallery. Here you can see some images of the valve gallery down below at the base of the dam. So that's sort of the high-level review of our operations in the Hudson River area, and specifically on Great Sacandaga Lake. I know and I hope there will be lots of questions, so I pause here to answer them to the best of my ability.
Thank you very much, John. Yeah, anybody that is tuning in, feel free to use that chat function, drop your questions or any comments for John in there. I'll moderate through those. And since this is being recorded and will be uploaded at a further date onto social media through YouTube, that's why I will ask that question, because if you're watching on YouTube, you're not going to see what's on our chat here. I have to say it or do it in some other way. So keep an eye out for that. It also means that folks, if you feel the need or desire to, you can share this later once it gets posted. So while we're waiting for anybody that wants to put any questions in the chat or some comments, I'll throw a couple things out of my notes toward here. You were showing images of the roadway over the embankment, and I just drove over that on Monday on my return from Hadley from a basketball game. Of course, it was dark, but the lights along the way, I'm quite familiar with that area. As we're waiting for some more questions, is there a particular spot at the dam, John, that you think is like just not even technically anything wondrous or anything, but just your favorite little spot?
Yeah, no, I appreciate that, Dave, and I think I like being down by the toe of the dam, or the dam on the downstream side is benched, as it were. And we have piezometers, devices that measure essentially a delta in the pressure in one area versus another. That gives you an idea of what kind of seepage is occurring. And so we've recently upgraded some of those to be remote and provide real-time data for both our personnel and the engineering consultant. So I like being sort of below and looking up at the dam, because there I think you really get an idea of the scale of that infrastructure, and coming from canals, which is no slouch in the impressive infrastructure department. It's really cool to see just that whole site with the dam itself, gatehouse, the spillway channel, and then the EJ West power plant, and certainly some pretty spectacular scenery in the background. So it's a very peaceful place, and it's interesting when you look at water retaining infrastructure, how much that can be in harmony with nature. When you talk about infrastructure and people talk about bridges and roads and certainly all the things that are necessary to make the world work today, for me, dams and locks and that sort of water retaining infrastructure are really quite beautiful, and typically in harmony with the natural settings that they're in. So that's a lot of fun. I did see I'm sorry, you should read it, David. I saw a comment about the elevation during the peak elevation in the 1913 flood of 24.4 feet in Albany.
Yeah, I will also point out that you were hearkening to the late great Professor Grasso there. Yeah, that very good on that one.
I can't help it. I do it at least once a day.
So yes, there's a question from Paul. It says, so if Albany flooded at 24.4 feet, what would that mean if it happened today?
Yeah, and I'd have to look up exactly what the elevation was during Hurricane Irene in 2011, but it's probably a good measuring stick, because and we may be dealing with two different datums. That peak elevation may have been recorded in 1929 GD maybe, and then you've got a 1988 datum. So I think it may not be an apples to apples comparison, but my recollections, the Albany peak elevation for Irene was 21.5 feet, maybe. And even at that elevation, you had water sort of coming over the bulkhead there, right along the ramps along 787 that are on the river side, and that there was some low level flooding. So then if you go 3 feet above that, you get a good indication of where that water might go. I think you'd have a lot of the same issues. Now, some of those areas have been built up. Some of the streets are probably a little bit higher, but there's no question that it would be extremely problematic. And one of the things we like to do in a significant flooding event is take a look at what that flow would otherwise be and what that would equate to as a peak flood elevation in different communities, and be able to quantify, as our chief engineer will, what the difference in peak elevation. And when we can look at the fact that we are reducing that peak elevation, not just in Albany, but in whether it's Fort Edward or Mechanicville or Waterford or Cohoes or Troy or Green Island or Rensselaer, then if we're reducing that peak elevation by 2 or 3 feet, we know we are keeping water maybe in people's backyards, which is not great, or certainly maybe in basements, as opposed to on the first floor of their homes, which can be devastating. So it is an important role that we do play.
And you had mentioned the chief engineer that you would have now making decisions, and you had mentioned during the presentation in the history portion about Engineer Sargent being responsible for the building of the dam, and I was just going to make quick little point, if anybody wants to visit his grave, it is in the Edinburgh Cemetery. And when it was first placed there, it was the only one that actually faced the reservoir. So that's an interesting tidbit of history if you're a dork that hangs out in grave and cemetery locations like myself. So I'm going to try to combine Catherine and Trisha's questions here a little bit. Catherine was asking when it had switched from being called a reservoir to a lake and why, if that's just a tourism and a marketing thing. And kind of along that, speaking of tourism marketing and such, are there any tours of the dam that are provided?
Yeah, so I'll call it a rebranding, essentially, of the reservoir. It took place in the 1960s, and it was a tourism based. The exact year escapes me, but it was very much a tourism based exercise. Reservoir did not connote maybe the level of enjoyment, recreational use, and that sort of thing that communities in Fulton and Saratoga counties that are on the reservoir wanted to see. So it was very much sort of a messaging / rebranding, but it did not change the operation of the reservoir or the regulating district's statutory mission. But I think if you spend any time up along Great Sacandaga Lake today, you will see that it is a very important recreational and economic resource and an ecological resource for the region. So maybe that rebranding was successful. And I am not aware of any tours. We certainly give a lot of tours of our facilities, and we give tours to the dam, whether it's school groups or legislators or other state government colleagues that reach out that want to equate themselves with our mission and our operations. But I'm not aware of any other tours presently of Great Sacandaga Lake.
Well, there's always the opportunity, and I'm just throwing that out there. But you had mentioned in the lead up to the building of the dam as well, several instances and documentation kind of calling toward regulating the upper Hudson area. And so I made a note here that you had the Benedict report to the Canal Commission, 1874. I'm presuming that's the Farrand Benedict who had proposed to canalize the Adirondacks. I believe he was a Vermonter and an educator from Vermonter that came over from the college and had proposed that. And there's some residual pieces of that in the Adirondacks, which leads me to a little shameless self-promotion about the Sacandaga Canal that was proposed, and how, for those of you tuning in, if you want to join me on February 8th, do a presentation for Fulton County Historical Society and the Fulton County Museum, a presentation called 15 Miles on the Sacandaga. So if you are a Sacandaga Valley enthusiast and also a canal enthusiast, you'll enjoy that one as well. So that was my shameless self-promotion. Thanks for the opportunity. I was wondering how I could fit that one in, and you gave me the exact way to do it.
Great.
I'm not seeing any other questions come in, but if anybody does have a last moment question, Howard says that Fred says hello. So hopefully you'll see that and you recognize that one, John.
Yeah, he's saying, unfortunately, hello from heaven these days, but we miss him. We miss him a lot. One other thing I wanted to note while you sort of look for any final questions, and we do get this question a lot, and I had it on my notes and neglected to mention. We had sort of the timeline for both the engineering and design part of the Conklingville Dam project, and then construction as far as how long that will take. But wanted to give everybody as accurate and clear sense of where we are on that timeline today. So we are very much in that engineering design phase, about halfway through that process. It's very complicated because we do have to involve the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission, and of course this project itself, it's absolutely critical that we get it done right. There's some additional investigation work in terms of an analysis that the engineering consultant is going to undertake. And we talk about when you might start to see work around Conklingville Dam, you'll start to see some very early preliminary work that supports that design effort as early as this year. In fact, if you're out around the dam next week, you may see some drilling on the toe of the dam. So that's the bottom of the downstream end, just to put in some additional testing wells to support that engineering and design work. But really, you won't see any major construction until 2024 and beyond. And critical to that, and I just did see a question on this, what is that going to do in terms of any impact on how the reservoir is managed and what lake levels we expect to see? Again, with the caveat that target elevation is really where we try and go to, where we try and end up by virtue of the flows downstream. So it's not as if we are designing to a specific number for a particular point of the year, but we do have historic average elevation, we have target elevation. So those things sort of form what most people expect in terms of the reservoir elevation at a particular time of year. And we don't, as a result of this project, anticipate any necessary changes to those elevations. So we want to do the work in a way that allows us to continue to maintain the reservoir normally. That might mean isolating one valve at a time, creative use of cofferdams, other construction methods that would not necessitate what some people have talked about, like draining of the lake, returning it to a river for a couple of years as this construction goes forward. That will not happen. Whether we might need to start a drawdown in the fall a few weeks earlier than people have traditionally seen, even that right now is not baked in sort of to this construction approach. But our design engineers, Bergman, the Office of General Services, the regulating district, all speaking with one voice here when we say there will not be a draining of the reservoir to do this project. We believe at this point that from a water levels perspective, it can be accomplished without anyone knowing that there's construction going on at the dam unless they drive down there and take a look. So that's the goal, that's the plan. Obviously, as we get into final design, we may fine tune that in terms of needing to start a drawdown in the fall, 1 year or another, maybe a little bit earlier, but we don't anticipate that at this point.
And since we're bumping into the 45-minute mark there, I think this is a good place to kind of wrap it up. And I know a lot of folks obviously view the Great Sacandaga as a tourism destination and a lake. And so I appreciate you spending the time this afternoon to talk about how it is really a regulated body of water, that you regulate the flows, and that it has a much larger purpose, but we can still get out there and enjoy it. So I want to thank everybody for tuning in. I've posted on the chat the contact information for the regulating district, as well as Schoharie Crossing. And if you feel so inclined, feel free to get a hold of us and we can communicate more about this. This has been a free program, but if you also feel generous, the Friends of Schoharie Crossing are a nonprofit organization that would be gladly willing to accept any monetary donations or memberships. The link for that can also be found in the chat. But otherwise, John Callaghan, thank you so much for your time, and I really appreciate it.
It was great to join everybody. It was my pleasure. And again, please visit our website and please look us up on Facebook. Work for the people, and we're very proud of the mission that we're entrusted with. So thanks again, everybody.
Thank you very much. Stay safe, be well.